highlighting the theme, of course, which is BRICS in Africa, collaboration for inclusive growth and prosperity in the fourth industrial revolution. Of course, speaking about how governments need to perhaps come together in order to enhance the cooperation. South Africa needs to become at the forefront as well of the development agenda, ensuring that infrastructure in itself is highly developed. And of course, we saw quite a lot of infrastructure investment being put into South Africa in place. A lot of commitments being set out as well by Xi Jinping with regards to just how much China's economy is expected to put together as well. I'm joined as well here by Martyn Davies, who is Head of Emerging Markets and Africa, Managing Director for Emerging Markets and Africa at Deloitte. Thank you so much for joining us, Martyn.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Having seen some of that address in itself, it clearly highlights as well just how necessary it is for all five nations to come together with perhaps one goal at a time like this, despite the fact that you have differing needs. Do you think that some of those goals will be attained through the summit?
Oh, this is the first BRICS summit I've been to where there's more cohesion in terms of view. And for better or for worse, this has come about through an errant unilateral trade policy from Donald Trump Republican administration in the US. We now have a binding sort of agreement, or principles at least, that we're all pro-globalization. I think the debate has been sort of, is globalization fueling inequality?
Yes.
But all of the, slightly ironically, all BRICS countries here are very pro-globalization. If we think back to the early 90s, all our respective countries, South Africa in 1994, we became reintegrated in the global economy. Russia post 1991, after the Soviet Union disintegrated. India's reform drive from 1991, and China's real reform drive from 1992. So we all embraced the global economy in the early 90s, and undoubtedly it's improved our people's livelihoods significantly in all our countries since that time. So it's something to defend.
Clearly, it's not just helping our countries alone, though. You have the likes of Namibia, Gabon, Angola, Senegal, Uganda, Togo, and most significantly, Rwanda, who have been highlighted, of course, as participant countries, especially to the BRICS Africa outreach session in itself. The significance of Rwanda, I think, is quite significant there. But what do you make of that partnership? Xi Jinping went there, Narendra Modi went there as well.
Yes, yeah. Look, I think it's two things. Firstly, at a sort of a BRICS macro level, does BRICS as an institution, as an aspirant institution, deepen or does it widen?
Yeah.
So it's sort of BRICS plus, and the plus largely, as you allude to, is African countries. And South Africa is the only member of a BRICS that I'm aware of really is that it's always extremely regionally collaborative. We're not seeing India draw in neighboring countries when it hosts the summit, and similarly so of China. So we clearly have a more Pan-African, more developmental agenda of how we interpret a BRICS and align these respective
forces. But one would
forces.
say that we perhaps need it most, considering perhaps the state of infrastructure in Africa.
I think what we need is countries like China, India, Brazil. These are highly populated countries.
Yeah.
What we need in our region is scalability, and this is only going to come about through integration. Hence, other countries participating. Hence, talk about multinational cross-border infrastructure, which the Chinese do very well, particularly in this part of the world.
Yeah. At the same time, what your hopes are for the end of the summit? I mean, I know it's still early days; it's only the beginning, right? Yeah. But towards the end, you have to come up with concrete evidence to show that this was a successful summit. What would you stand to hope for?
Look, I think everyone have different interpretations of that, Arabella. I think for me, it's about an obvious prediction. The 5 BRICS member governments will come out of the statement which will be pro-liberalized trade, seeking to retain the predictability of the World Trade Organization, WTO, and its rules, countering unilateral actions, particularly from the US. I think other points, maybe looking forward slightly, one thing slightly disappointing for me is the engagement, especially between South Africa and China within the BRICS and bilaterally, has always been state-owned enterprises engaging state-owned enterprises. And that really hasn't come off too well, particularly in our context. I want to see private capital from China, from South Africa, engaging each other. That's largely absent to an extent here at the BRICS summit. As we go forward, the best indicator, I think, of confidence in our own economy and African economies will be less state-directed capital, which is relatively easy, particularly from China through its policy banks, state-owned banks. But a real indicator of confidence is going to be private capital, different perceptions of risk, and so-called new economy out of China.
Yeah.
And in our case, it's South African A-team, corporate SA, gaining arguably more traction, more preferential market access, negotiated by our government into the Chinese market, amongst other places. That's what I want to see happen go forward.
Yeah. Do you see them taking that mantle, though? Because the issue then becomes that you take all those factors and you say to yourselves, we need CEOs, we need corporate South Africa, but business confidence in South Africa in itself is just very low. So how do we expect even other corporates to then, bulk up and come into South Africa? So we need to sort ourselves out first.
Correct. The more we often talk about our geopolitical collaborators, or even in this case, geoeconomic competitors, the more we talk about ourselves. And if we're not investing in our own economy, how can we expect outsiders to? I think one of them may be intangible from a BRICS summit, and something which South Africa has not done particularly too well is around sort of peer pressure to getting high economic growth rates. These countries were initially selected because of their long-term growth outlook trajectories. Think 5, 6, 7% plus. We have clearly underperformed. What's the intangible learnings, peer-to-peer learnings, if you will, or developmental models? How do we drive, which we desperately need in this country, a 5, 6, 7% growth rate, such as the Indians, such as the Chinese? This doesn't apply so much to Brazil, Russia, but certainly applies to the more Far Eastern members of BRICS, amongst other economies as well.
Yeah. One of the main things will be regulation, ensuring that we open ourselves up to whether it be investment, whether it be a sense of incoming business from anywhere. Do you think we're perhaps stepping up to being in the right direction and ensuring that regulation is quick enough to allow for those processes?
It's early days. We need a proactive state, and as you allude to, we need an agile state to create necessary policies, environments to attract investment, FDI. But most importantly is confidence. How does that come about? It doesn't come about through slow incremental change. It comes about, I think in our case, which is necessary, shock therapy. And we have not yet seen that. I think also we saw the reporting yesterday and this morning around the headline figures of loans committed by Chinese policy banks into South Africa. And we get very excited about the figures. This is a country that does not lack capital. We have very deep capital markets in South Africa. What we lack, arguably, is intellectual property. The more important question is not so much how much money we receive from wherever it may be, but how do we motivate and attract the intellectual property that comes naturally with the capital and embed that into our own domestic economy. I think that sets a very good foundation for long-term sustainable growth and development.
Yeah, but we did see some people seeing a silver lining in South Africa's economy, wouldn't you say? I mean, China investing as much as it did and committing to invest as much as it did yesterday surely tells you a different story about South Africa's economy that perhaps we aren't seeing, or am I also seeing it wrong in that sense?
Well, this is not so much FDI as it was loans to translate in Eskom. So if those loans are later converted into equity, that would ultimately be privatization by stealth.
True.
Interesting play.
Yeah.
So let's think about how do we align structural reform. That particularly refers to state enterprises. It refers to the regulatory environment you talk to, and BRICS capital, in this case Chinese capital. Because without that structural reform, that capital ain't coming in. If we start to privatize or partially privatize our state-owned enterprises, then clearly that capital will become investment.
Yeah.
And that's what I also allude to when I talk about shock therapy.
Quite an interesting one. Martyn, thank you so much for the time. Hopefully we can continue the chat at some other stage as well during this BRICS Summit as well. That's Martyn Davies, of course, the Managing Director for Emerging Markets and Africa at Deloitte. Of course, we've unpacked just what has happened. It's been officially opened, the 10th BRICS Summit here at the Sandton Convention Center in Johannesburg. President Cyril Ramaphosa, President Xi Jinping, and of course delegates through from Russia, India as well, and Brazil, of course. It continues to be a thriving summit in itself. A lot is anticipated to come out of the remaining 2 days as well. We will be here live to unpack all of that, and we'll give you more as the day progresses. But for now, it's goodbye from me.